Welcome to study session 15, Ethics in Clinical Psychology. Introduction. Ethics are standards of correct professional behavior. The standards exist so that clients, students, research participants, and others are well served. The American Psychological Association developed a code of ethics for psychologists shortly after the Second World War in 1953. Since then, 9 revised editions of the Ethical Code have been published, including the most recent edition published in 2002 and amended in 2010. In this study, you will be introduced to 5 general principles identified in the APA Ethics Code as a guide to professional practice, categories of the ethical standards as stated in the APA Ethical Code, and the individual standards that are most relevant to the clinical psychologist. Learning outcomes. At the end of this study session, you should be able to 1. Discuss 5 general principles identified in the APA Ethics Code as a guide to professional practice. 2. Explain the 10 categories of ethical standards as stated in the APA Ethical Code. 3. State some of the individual standards that are most relevant to the clinical psychologist. The 5 general principles of the APA Ethics Code. There are 5 general principles associated with APA Ethics Code, which are listed below. Principle A: beneficence and non-maleficence. Principle B: fidelity and responsibility. Principle C: integrity. D: justice. E: respect for people's rights and dignity. Principle A: beneficence and non-maleficence. Psychologists are expected to attend to benefit those with whom they work and avoid doing harm. Principle B: fidelity and responsibility. Psychologists are expected to develop relationships of trust with those with whom they work. They are expected to demonstrate awareness of their professional and scientific responsibilities to society and to the specific communities in which they work. Principle C: integrity. Psychologists are expected to promote accuracy, honesty, and truthfulness in the science, teaching, and practice of psychology. Principle D: justice. Psychologists are expected to recognize that all people should have access to benefit from the contribution of psychology. Psychologists are expected to avoid bias and not to condone unjust practices. Principle E: respect for people's rights and dignity. Psychologists are expected to respect people's right to privacy, confidentiality, and self-determination. The 10 categories of the ethical standards are stated in the APA Ethical Code. The ethical standards set forth enforceable rules for conduct as psychologists. Most of the ethical standards are written broadly in order to apply to psychologists in varied roles, although the application of an ethical standard may vary depending on the context. The ethical standards are not exhaustive. The fact that a given code is not specifically addressed by an ethical standard does not mean that it is necessarily either ethical or unethical. The 10 broad categories of the ethical standards made up of enforceable rules of conduct for psychologists are: 1. Resolving ethical issues. 2. Competence. 3. Human relations. 4. Privacy and confidentiality. 5. Advertising and other public statements. C. Record keeping and fees. 7. Education and training. 8. Research and publication. 9. Assessment. And 10. Therapy. 1. Resolving ethical issues. If psychologists ethical responsibilities conflict with law, regulations, and other government legal authority. Psychologists clarify the nature of the conflict, make known their commitment to the ethics code, and take reasonable steps to resolve the conflict consistent with the general principles and ethical standards of the ethics code. Under no circumstances may this standard be used to justify or defend violating human rights. Likewise, if the demand of an organization with whom psychologists are affiliated or for whom they are working are in conflict with this ethics code, psychologists clarify the nature of the conflict, make known their commitment to the ethics code, and take reasonable steps to resolve the conflict consistent with the general principles and ethical standards of the ethics code. Under no circumstances may this standard be used to justify or defend violating human rights. 2. Competence. Psychologists provide services, teach, and conduct research with populations and in areas only within the boundaries of their competence, based on their education, training, supervised experience, consultation, study, or professional experience. Psychologists planning to provide services, teach, or conduct research involving populations, areas, techniques, or technologies new to them undertake relevant education, training, supervised experience, consultation, or study. In emergencies, when psychologists provide services to individuals for whom other mental health services are not available and for which psychologists have not obtained the necessary training, psychologists may provide such services in order to ensure that services are not denied. The services are discontinued as soon as the emergency has ended and appropriate services are available. Psychologists' work is based upon established scientific and professional knowledge of the discipline. Psychologists who delegate work to employees, supervisees, or research or teaching assistants, or who use the services of others such as interpreters, take reasonable steps. Reasonable steps a psychologist take before delegating work to any professional. 1. Avoid delegating such work to persons who have a multiple relationship with those being served that would likely lead to exploitation or loss of objectivity. 2. Authorize only those responsibilities that such persons can be expected to perform competently on the basis of their education, training, or experience, either independently or with the level of supervision being provided. 3. See that such persons perform these services competently. 3. Human relations. Psychologists do not engage in unfair discrimination or behavior that is harassing or demeaning to persons with whom they interact in their work based on age, gender identity, race, ethnicity, culture, national origin, religion, sexual orientation, disability, socio-economic status, or any basis prescribed by law. Psychologists take reasonable steps to avoid harming their clients, students, supervisees, research participants, organizational clients, and others with whom they work, and to minimize harm where it is foreseeable and unavoidable. Psychologists do not engage in sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is sexual solicitation, physical advances, or verbal or non-verbal conduct that is sexual in nature, that occurs in connection with the psychologist's activities or roles as a psychologist, and that either 1. is unwelcome, is offensive, or creates a hostile workplace or educational environment, and the psychologist knows or is told this, or 2. is sufficiently severe or intends to be abusive to a reasonable person in the context. Sexual harassment can consist of a single intense or severe act or of multiple persistent or pervasive acts. 4. Privacy and confidentiality. Psychologists have a primary obligation and take reasonable precaution to protect confidential information obtained through or stored in any medium, recognizing that the extent and limits of confidentiality may be regulated by law or established by institutional rules or professional or scientific relationships. Psychologists discuss with persons, including, to the extent feasible, persons who are legally incapable of giving informed consent and their legal representatives, and organizations with which they establish a scientific or professional relationship. The relevant limits of confidentiality, and 2. The foreseeable uses of the information generated through their psychological activities. Unless it is not feasible or is contraindicated, the discussion of confidentiality occurs at the outset of the relationship and thereafter as new circumstances may warrant. Psychologists who offer services, products, or information via electronic transmission inform clients or patients of the risk to privacy and limits of confidentiality. Before recording the voices or images of individuals to whom they provide services, psychologists obtain permission from all such persons or their legal representatives. Psychologists may disclose confidential information with the appropriate consent of the organizational client, the individual client or patient, or another legal authorized person on behalf of the patient unless prohibited by law. Psychologists disclose confidential information without the consent of the individual only as mandated by law or where permitted by law for a valid purpose, such as 1. Provide needed professional services. 2. Obtain appropriate professional consultation. 3. Protect the patient, psychologist, or others from harm. Or 4. Obtain payment for services from a patient, in which instance disclosure is limited to the minimum that is necessary to achieve the purpose. When consulting with colleagues, 1. Psychologists do not disclose confidential information that reasonably could lead to the identification of a patient, research participant, or other person or organization with whom they have a confidential relationship, unless they have obtained the prior consent of the person or organization, or the disclosure cannot be avoided. And 2. They disclose information only to the extent necessary to achieve the purpose of the consultation. Psychologists do not disclose in their writings, lectures, or other public media confidential, personally identifiable information concerning their clients, patients, students, research participants, organizational clients, or other recipients of the services that they obtain during the course of their work, unless 1. They take reasonable steps to disguise the person or organization. 2. The person or organization has consented in writing, or there is a legal authorization to do so. 5. Advertising and other public statements. Psychologists do not knowingly make public statements that are false, deceptive, or fraudulent concerning their research, practice, or other work activities, or those of persons or organizations with which they are affiliated. Psychologists do not make false, deceptive, or fraudulent statements concerning 1. Their training, experience, or competence. 2. Their academic degrees. 3. Their credentials. 4. Their institution. Take 2. 4. Their institutional or association affiliations. 5. Their services. 6. The scientific or clinical basis for or result of degrees of success of their services. 7. Their fees. Or 8. Their publication or research findings. Psychologists claim degrees as credentials for their health services only if those degrees 1. Were earned from a regionally accredited educational institution, or 2. Were the basis for psychology licensure by the state in which they practice. When psychologists provide public advice or comment via print, internet, or other electronic transmission, they take precaution to ensure that statements 1. Are based on their professional knowledge, training, or experience in accord with appropriate psychological literature and practice. 2. Are otherwise consistent with this ethics code. And 3. Do not indicate that a professional relationship has been established with the recipient. 6. Record keeping and fees. Psychologists create, and to the extent the records are under their control, maintain, disseminate, store, retain, and dispose of records and data relating to their professional and scientific work in order to 1. Facilitate provision of services later by them or by other professionals. 2. Allow for replication of research design and analysis. 3. Meet institutional requirements. 4. Ensure accuracy of billing and payments. And 5. Ensure compliance with law. 7. Education and training. Psychologists responsible for education and training programs take reasonable steps to ensure that the programs are designed to provide the appropriate knowledge and proper experiences and to meet the requirements for licensure, certification, or other goals for which claims are made by the program. They also take reasonable steps to ensure that there is a current and accurate description of the program content, including participation in required course or program-related counseling, psychotherapy, experiential group, consulting projects, or community service, training goals and objectives, stipends and benefits, and requirements that must be met for satisfactory completion of the program. This information must be made readily available to all interested parties. Psychologists do not engage in sexual relationships with students or supervisees who are in their department, agency, or training center, or over whom psychologists have or are likely to have evaluative authority. Research and publication. Among other obligations for research and publication, psychologists are expected to provide accurate information about the research proposals and obtain approval prior to conducting the research when institutional approval is required. They conduct the research in accordance with the approved research protocol. When obtaining informed consent, psychologists should inform participants about 1. The purpose of the research, expected duration, and procedures. 2. Their right to decline to participate and to withdraw from the research once participation has begun. 3. The foreseeable consequences of declining or withdrawing. 4. Reasonably foreseeable factors that may be expected to influence the willingness to participate, such as potential risk, discomfort, or adverse effects. 5. Any prospective research benefits. 6. Limits of confidentiality. 7. Incentives for participation. And 8. Whom to contact for questions about the research and research participants' rights. They provide opportunity for the prospective participants to ask questions and receive answers. Psychologists conducting intervention research involving the use of experimental treatments clarify to participants at the outset of the research: 1. The experimental nature of the treatment. 2. The services that will or will not be available to the control groups if appropriate. 3. The means by which assignment to treatment and control groups will be available. 4. Available treatment alternative if an individual does not wish to participate in the research or wishes to withdraw once a study has begun. And 5. Compensation for or monetary costs of participating, including, if appropriate, whether reimbursement for the participant or a third-party payer will be sought. 9. Assessment. Psychologists base the opinions contained in their recommendations, reports, and diagnostic or evaluative statements, including forensic testimony, on information and techniques sufficient to substantiate their findings. Except in exceptional cases, psychologists provide opinions of the psychological characteristics of individuals only after they have conducted an examination of the individuals adequate to support their statement or conclusions. When, despite reasonable efforts, such an examination is not practicable, psychologists document the efforts they made and the result of these efforts, clarify the probable impact of their limited information on the reliability and validity of their opinions, and appropriately limit the nature and extent of their conclusions or recommendations. When psychologists conduct a record review or provide consultation or supervision, and an individual examination is not warranted nor necessary for the opinion, psychologists explain this and the sources of information on which they base their conclusions and recommendations. With regard to use of assessments, psychologists administer, adapt, score, interpret, or use valid and reliable assessment techniques, interviews, tests, or instruments in a manner and for purposes that are appropriate in light of the research on or evidence of the usefulness and proper application of the techniques. Psychologists use assessment methods that are appropriate to an individual's language, preference, and competence, unless the use of an alternative language is relevant to the assessment issues. Psychologists obtain informed consent for assessment, evaluations, or diagnostic services except 1. Testing is mandated by law or governmental regulations. 2. Informed consent is implied because testing is conducted as a routine education, institutional, or organizational activity. For example, when participants voluntarily agree to assessment when applying for a job. Or 3. One purpose of the testing is to evaluate decisional capacity. Informed consent includes an explanation of the nature and purpose of the assessment, fees, involvement of third parties, and limits of confidentiality and sufficient opportunity for the client-patient to ask questions and receive answers. When interpreting assessment results, psychologists take into account the purpose of the assessment as well as the various test factors, test-taking abilities, and other characteristics of the person being assessed, such as situational, personal, linguistic, and cultural differences that might affect psychologists' judgment or reduce the accuracy of their interpretations. 10. Therapy. When obtaining informed consent to therapy, psychologists inform clients or patients as early as is feasible in a therapeutic relationship about the nature and anticipated course of therapy, fees, involvement of third parties, and limits of confidentiality, and provide sufficient opportunity for the client or patient to ask questions and receive answers. When obtaining informed consent for treatment for which generally recognized techniques and procedures have been established, psychologists inform their patients of the developing nature of the treatment, the potential risk involved, the alternative treatments that may be available, and the voluntary nature of their participation. When the therapist is a trainee and the legal responsibility for the treatment provided resides with the supervisor, the patient, as part of the informed consent procedure, is informed that the therapist is in training and is being supervised and is given the name of the supervisor. Psychologists do not engage in sexual intimacies with current therapy clients or patients, nor with individuals they know to be close relatives, guardians, or significant others of current patients. Psychologists do not terminate therapy to circumvent this standard. Psychologists do not accept as therapy patients persons with whom they have engaged in sexual intimacies. Psychologists do not engage in sexual intimacies with former patients for at least 2 years after cessation or termination of therapy. Psychologists terminate therapy when it becomes reasonably clear that a patient no longer needs the service, is not likely to benefit, or is being harmed by continued service. Psychologists may terminate therapy when threatened or otherwise endangered by the client or patient or another person with whom the client or patient has a relationship, except where precluded by the actions of clients or patients or third-party payers. Prior to termination, psychologists provide pre-termination counseling and suggest alternative service providers as appropriate. Summary of study session. In this study session, you have learned that 1. The 5 general principles that act as ideals guiding the clinical psychologist's professional conduct are beneficence and non-maleficence, fidelity and responsibility, integrity, justice, and respect for people's rights and dignity. 2. The ethics code is intended to provide guidance for psychologists and standards of professional conduct that can be applied by the APA and other bodies that choose to adopt them. 3. Beneficence and non-maleficence. Psychologists are expected to attempt to benefit those with whom they work and avoid doing harm. 4. The ethical standards set forth enforceable rules for conduct as psychologists. Most of the ethical standards are written broadly in order to apply to psychologists in varied roles, although the application of an ethical standard may vary depending on the context. 5. Resolving ethical issues. If psychologists' ethical responsibilities conflict with the law, regulations, or other governing legal authority, psychologists clarify the nature of the conflict. We have now come to the end of GCE 206. Thank you.